Well, thank you for joining us today in today's festival event, Race, Writing, and Virtual Worlds. My name is Vincent Ternida, and I'm a board member for ACWW. Launched in 2013, LiterASIAN is an annual festival of Pacific Rim Asian Canadian writing and a community building initiative for the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, ACWW. The LiterASIAN event is really the first of its kind within Canada, with an important mandate to promote and celebrate the works of Asian Canadian writers and artists through author readings, panel discussions, and workshop events. In doing so, we create an important and unique networking opportunity between professional and emerging writers, students, and members of the broader public to learn and discuss topics of importance to Asian Canadian writing. This is the first time that we are holding our festival virtually and to a worldwide audience. A big shout out to everyone from across the world who are watching us from the comfort of their own homes and offices. Thank you for sharing your time with us from wherever you may be. And we're going to thank our partners and sponsors, the Vancouver Manuscript Intensive, Canada Council for the Arts, DC Artscape, Pacific Canada Heritage Center, Rice Paper Magazine, Iron Dog Books, Chinatown Youth Collaborative, our wonderful team of volunteers, Sophie Monk, our festival coordinator, for without her, this would fall apart. Anyway, thank you to all our publishers who provided the authors' books. Each book is for sale at the book sales table. If you're in Vancouver, you can go to Iron Dog Books, which is in East Van, really close to El Purgarcito and the Slow Can Bar. And I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Alisa C. De Jesus is a fellow board member at ACWW and is a graduate student of UBC's English Language and Literature Department. She researches Orientalism and material cultures of the long 18th century. Without further ado, we have Alisa.
Thanks, Vincent. So as we start, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Vancouver on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I acknowledge all the nations who have cared for the land, recorded and unrecorded. I am grateful to have a home here and recognize my complicity and therefore responsibility as a settler of Asian heritage and descent to work towards learning how to better my relations with the original sovereigns of this land. I recognize that we've all logged onto this webinar from different locations and territories, so I'd like to share our research. It's called Native Land, so you can find out whose land you're logging on from, and it does not just cover the colonization of North America. So I'll just put it in the chat here if people want to find out. Now, it's my pleasure and excitement to introduce today's featured authors and writers. The first of whom I will introduce is Kawika Guillermo, who is the author of Stamped, an anti-travel novel, All Flowers Bloom, and many short stories. He has lived in Portland, Las Vegas, Seattle, Gimhae, South Korea, Nanjing, China, Hong Kong, and currently resides in Vancouver, Canada. Kawika Guillermo is the pseudonym for Christopher B. Patterson, who is an assistant professor in the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia. Chris's research focuses on trans-Pacific discourses of literature, games, and films through the lens of empire studies, queer theory, and creative writing. His first academic book, Transitive Cultures, Anglophone Literature of the Trans-Pacific, published by Rutgers University Press, examines Southeast Asian diasporic novels focused on queer migrants, those who resist ethnic stereotypes, and those who feel few ties to their ostensible homelands. His second academic book, Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games, sees video games as an artistic expression of global empire by playing them erotically and as Asiatic commodities. Our next guest for today is Danielle Wong, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literatures at the University of British Columbia. Represent! Prior to joining UBC's English department, she was a postdoctoral associate in the Asian American Studies program at Cornell University. Her research and teaching interests focus on historical and contemporary relationships between race, empire, and new technologies. Her current book project examines Asian North American new media productions and performances and traces a genealogy of virtual Asianness by analyzing how Asian North American racialization has and continues to be interwoven with shifting concepts of mediation and virtuality. She is also a faculty affiliate of the Asian, Canadian, and Migration Studies program at UBC. Welcome, Danielle and Kawika, sorry. So I'm just going to start off sort of with the way today is structured this afternoon. First, we're going to sort of do this in three parts. The first of which is going to be what I like to think of as our feature or spotlight portion, where our panelists will have a chance to introduce and talk about their work or read from their work, and hopefully have their work in conversation with each other. And then next is in the spirit of the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, sort of a workshop portion where we'll get to hear more from them about writing and any advice they have to writers looking to explore the virtuality, Asianness, and race, and sort of ask them also what they would like to imagine for the speculative genre. And then the third part, that workshop portion, I'm hoping will spill onto the Q&A with the audience. So I'm going to start us off with a framing question, but I'd like to also frame that question today, if you'll let me. So on top of a desire to feature and learn from young academics and writers based in Vancouver, this panel topic was inspired by our pivot towards a virtual festival and the current climate of anti-Asian racism that, to quote an interview with Dr. J.B. Katungal, is getting recycled in Vancouver and beyond in physical and virtual spaces. I think that today's panel and hearing from Danielle and Chris or Kawika about their work will bring light to the current situation of the pandemic and are taking this grassroots Asian community-focused festival online this year. On that note, I think that the phenomenon of techno-orientalism is a good topic for connecting and introducing our featured writers' work today. So techno-orientalism was originally written about in 1995 by David Morley and Kevin Robbins as a way to name the West's dualistic wariness of and regard for Japan's post-war economic and technological prowess and influence. Although the term was only coined then and in that context, it is a phenomenon that before the mid-90s and onto today continues to name, to quote Chris, how both anti-Asian racism and pro-Asian racism have permeated every future we tend to imagine. So my first question for you, Danielle and Chris, as you introduce us to your work today, what does techno-orientalism mean to you? And how is it informed by anti-Asian and pro-Asian racism? How are your works located in, engaging with, and or reimagining this phenomenon? So Danielle, would you be all right with going first?
Sure. I'm going to refrain from trying to build a lecture around this. I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So I'm not going to assume that everybody is familiar with the term Orientalism. So techno-Orientalism builds upon, engages with the term Orientalism, which many might know or not, and that's fine, was coined by Edward Said to name institutions, systems, structures, but also like text, popular media that produce an image of the other that informs the image of the self, which is the European self, right? So there's the Oriental other, which is backwards, pre-modern, exotic, traditional, that then informs the production of the rational, enlightened, right, progress, modern European self. And so techno-Orientalism is increasingly used to name continues that kind of imperialist and colonial project from the other direction, right? So rather than being stuck in a past or exotic, techno-Orientalism frames the so-called Orient and Oriental people as displaced in a future. Right, so the lack of humanity or lack of humanness is framed as the other that is incredibly technophilic or associated in varying ways to technology, a kind of overly commodified, technologized future. And often we think about techno-Orientalism as a narrative or a discourse that names the West's anxieties about a future that is not right? So techno-Orientalism, in other words, is a narrative that secures the West's rightful place as architects of the future. And here I'm quoting a bit from David Rowe, Betsy Huang, and Greta New in their collection of essays in techno-Orientalism. Sorry, my cat is meowing. So that's how I would frame what techno-orientalism is. And I think the second part of your question is how our work interfaces with this.
That's a good word for it.
So very briefly, often I think scholarship has tried to kind of rebuttal, right, techno-orientalist discourses as a way of correcting it or recuperating bad images that's produced through the techno-orientalist discourses, right? And usually it goes something like, if Asians were historically and continue to be understood as machine-like and subhuman, not quite human, then the projects that respond to that sometimes emphasize that we have feelings, we have interiority, we are human. And my project, these are very valid projects, important projects, but my work is a little more interested in staying with techno-orientalism as a way of thinking about what this indicates in terms of anxieties about late capitalism, globalization, but the ongoing histories of colonialism. So I'm actually interested not so much in saving Asians from techno-orientalism, but thinking carefully with techno-orientalist aesthetics, discourses, images, and histories as a way of producing a critique around what Asian racialization is and continues to be.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and I think today that's what we're going to talk about, like when we continue to occupy the space of the virtual and the techno and the orientalist, what sort of interesting scenes or conversation or forms even of critique within arise. So very excited for that. Did you have an excerpt from your book project you wanted to share with us today?
I'm sure. I wasn't sure if Chris was going to respond to that question, or are we doing that?
Yeah, I sort of saw it as a framing question to frame and introduce your work before you share it. But Chris, if you had if there was anything you wanted to say in response, or you wanted to start off by answering that question as well.
Yeah, we can break it up a bit, because I wasn't going to read from my work exactly. I was going to talk about how it relates to that question. But just to, join the frame, I guess, I should probably say something about that word pro-Asian racism, because I literally just made that up over social media 2 days ago as a way to kind of provoke people to come to this. And so it's a very tentative frame. It's like strategic essentialism. I'm just going to disown it as soon as I start using it. And the only people I can find that have used it before is like some people who use it in like racist statements. So let's not go overboard with it. But basically what I was thinking, and this, because I'm just trying to think through the kind of anxieties that drive those questions about anti-Asian racism in the virtual world, when we are also living in a moment, or the past 20 or 30 years, that has been where Asian Americans and Asian Canadians are situated within a larger structure, wherein the kind of civilities, the rights, and the privileges that we enjoy are not parceled out to everyone equally, right? And so we have a sense of demanding certain privileges for ourselves, when in fact we are the kind of the object, we are the proof, we are the living proof that democracy and capitalism work. Right, so the more privileges that we get, the worse it can get for others. And so like Asian American as a term in the 1970s was partially created first as a political term, not really to talk about people, but to talk about certain politics. That was trying to reverse that work of pitting minorities against each other, within a field of scarcity. And so I want us to kind of think about that, because of those activists and artists and writers who created that term and who were very active in those movements. They also wrote a lot about, what I tangentially call pro-Asian racism, or racist love, as Frank Chin, one of the activists at that time, puts it. And racist love to him was the way that Asians are kind of fetishized and loved and accepted, Asian Americans, particularly for him, in ways that are detrimental and violent to other minorities and other groups, and to Asians who live in Asia. Right. This was during the Vietnam War. So the more, so-called good Asians that you had on your side, the more you could represent multiculturalism and democracy and capitalism as good things. right? And then you could show these other nations are not as diverse as us, therefore let's go to war with them, therefore they are ungrievable bodies, and all that. And so there's just so much complications, I think, when we think about anti-Asian racism, and when we're not thinking about how the privileges that we enjoy are, that when we celebrate those privileges, that's not a social justice project, you know, unless it's doled out equally to everyone, and unless we are able to really try and decenter or dethrone whiteness from, you know, from something that we come to asking for acceptance from, right? And so I think that's the very problem in some ways of how, and it's also an opportunity for us to think about how, you know, so-called pro-Asian racism, can't think of a better term right now, is also violent to us, right? Asian Americans, Asian Canadians are 3 times less likely to seek mental health treatment. We're far less likely to report sexual assault. We're basically killing ourselves in order to meet the demands of being a model minority. And so the violence that happens from pro-Asian racism is not just onto others, it's also killing us. And I think that's something that we can, I also want to kind of bring to the table when we think about science fiction, because science fiction loves Asians, they love tech bros, love Asians, people who are dictating our futures seem to love Asians, love going to Asia, love Asian women, as we know, like, let's be real here. And so I think that that is something that we need to keep to the forefront. Yeah, that's my frame.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, it seems like it's about asking ourselves in the work that we do to counter anti-Asian racism, are we feeding in, you know, to this feed of the model minority? Are we setting ourselves up as these model minorities, which in turn harms other communities and groups sort of in our favor in this capitalistic competition for resources and working towards the West? Yeah, thank you for sharing that and talking a bit more about where you were coming from when you talked about pro-Asian racism. On that note, Danielle, did you want to share an excerpt from your book? And
sure. Yeah, as a disclaimer, they're kind of just pieces from a first chapter of this ongoing book project that will feel like pieces that I've stitched together. But that's okay, I think, because in some ways the chapter is thinking about fragments and pieces. And I'm also just going to share a couple of images. Hopefully this works. Please just let me know if it's not working. And I do apologize if my cat was trying to join in the conversation. This is part of what's happening in gathering under COVID. Okay. So the chapter is called Pores, P-O-R-E-S, as in skin pores. Okay. In the final moments of Alex Garland's film Ex Machina, an android who has just killed her creator stands in front of a row of wardrobes that contain her predecessors. 5 android women, each turned off one by one to make room for the next AI prototype. Ava, who was held captive inside her programmer's remote research facility since birth, pauses when she opens the door to one particular defunct android. And here I will share an image, or attempt to share an image. So this is the android who's inside the closet. His name is Jade, right? The Asian android, and the more synthetic looking one, more emphatically a robot, is Ava. I will show another image later. Okay. This discarded robot named Jade looks like a naked Asian woman with smooth skin and long black hair. It is Ava, however, who is technically naked. Her body structure, made of carbon fiber, metal, and plastic, is shaped in the frame of a young, thin woman, but is not covered with synthetic skin. Ava's face, the face of white Swedish actor Alicia Vikander, is, as the film's script puts it, the one part of her that is not obviously an inorganic construct. Ava disconnects Jade's left arm and seamlessly fastens it to herself, as if already knowing it would be a perfect fit. She then proceeds to peel off and transfer Jade's skin, piece by piece, to her robot frame. When her whole body is covered with Asian skin, Ava puts on a brunette wig and stands in front of the mirrored panels of the wardrobes, inspecting her new body. And I'm going to see if I can share this other image of the final. Right, so what we see here is the Ava's transformation wearing Jade, the Asian android skin. And in that moment, that Jade turns to look and seemingly smile at Ava. So the film concludes with Ava standing in the middle of a busy urban intersection, passing as a white woman. Ava is free for now. Her freedom is precariously hinged on what Anne Chang describes as capability, or the ability to sustain the moment. It is not only Ava's newly grafted skin that threatens to betray her or expose her, but her mind as well. Program based on a fictional search engine company's mining of online activities around the world, big data is key to her life-likeness. This software is actually wetware, a system of chaotic and imperfect patterns that arrange and rearrange at a molecular level, adapting and evolving in real time. The audience is therefore left to wonder at the end of the film how Ava will remain alive without real-time updates. Who will update or maintain her wetware? Given how it is this skin that allows Ava to stand on a street as a woman, how will Ava repair or replace her synthetic skin if it is damaged or worn out? Ava depends not only on the ability to sustain the moment through program updates, but also on her fleshly instantiation of that moment. So if this ephemeral freedom, as Chang suggests, is the fantasy of living on as a thing for the social subject who is an object, then the life of this object person can be theorized as new media. To be alive as new media is to be updated. As Wendy Chun points out, new media are only new in so much as they are updated. She writes, "New media live and die by the update. The end of the update, the end of the object. Things and people not updating are things and people lost in distress or in distress, for users have become creatures of the update." As neither completely thing nor person but new media, Ava's continued passing, or her ability to sustain the moment, is dependent on software and hardware upkeep that affords Ava her whiteness. If Ava embodies a transitional or transitory freedom of the moment, a new media temporality, then this temporality, the sense of time, is materialized by skin that was designed as Asian. So why is it that Asian skin materializes and visualizes the temporality of life as new media? What makes this simultaneously raced and deraced surface particularly compatible with a system update that marks both transitory vulnerability and, later in the chapter, possibility? For Chang, Asian American female personhood is assembled through ornament or synthetic invention and design, rendering Asiatic femininity a style that is promiscuously transferable as an abstraction that materializes. In my account of the ongoing histories of popular Asiatic forms, ornamental Asian skin is everyday new media that not only indexes an update, but is a material informational update. So this chapter's turn to Asian skin's porousness through the film, and in the second half to K-beauty, is a turn to the temporality of bodily, microscopic, and imagined racial contact under global capitalism. Informed by Chun's definition of new media as accelerated forms of late capitalism, I want to consider how organic pores might be new media, right? Organic pores as new media that visualize, materialize, and are discourses of Asianness. Pores, which are nearly invisible hair follicle openings that allow for oil, sweat, and other particles to surface, render skin organic. They blur the boundaries between the body and its environment. But they also increasingly function as texts and commodities, in that pores are narrated, they're worked on, they're transformed through skincare practices and products, and circulated as visual productions in digital media like K-beauty, vlogs, and Instagram posts. So thus my analysis of pores in this chapter moves between and obscures the barriers between the biological, the synthetic, and the discursive. In other words, I want to think about actual Asian skin as a new media platform. If skin, as Mitali Thakur argues, is a material semiotic surface that produces a point of relationship between people, between people, marking exteriority and alterity, demarcating one object from another, then Asian skin's exceptional porousness, its particular proneness to being a contact zone or proxy, and here I'm also thinking of COVID-19 narratives, right, throws into confusion the clear boundaries between exteriority and interiority. It is Asian skin's porousness, I contend, that troubles clear-cut differences between organic and inorganic. Rather than understanding the relationship between epidermis and race as one of only color and contour, this chapter's turn to the virtually invisible processes of skin cells brings together what Simone Brown calls digital epidermalization and analog, right, epidermis. The multiple scales of skin reveal the overlapping stories of empire and militarism that render Asian skin historically, right, not just in this moment, a new technology. I'll jump ahead to another short section. So this section I'll conclude on is called Virtual Cells, Honeycomb, Dew, Glass. And this is the K-beauty section, or the film and the K-beauty thing come together. The film script, Ex Machina, the film script ascribes volition and action to Jade's skin rather than Jade herself when Ava applies it to her frame. So the film states that Jade's skin, quote, sucks itself to the honeycomb mesh of Ava's frame, quote, as if the mesh and the underside of the skin are magnetized, attracted to each other. Narrating Jade's skin as desiring to be attached to another body, as desiring removal, prompts us to think about race and racialization not only through the racial subject, right, in this case Jade, but also as the processes of circulation and mediation. The peeling and removal of skin from the Asian subject both throws into the question the security of the self-enclosed individual and produces a potentiality that risks being converted back into neoliberal productivity. In the case of Ex Machina, Jade's torn skin gains capital, accrues capital in its abstractability, in its ability to be removed. So to examine this, jumping ahead, I am interested in how biotechnologies imagined by the film, right, in particular Ava's honeycomb structure and the porcelain poreless qualities, where you can't see any blemishes, of Jade's skin, index real-life implications for discourses about Asian interfaces. Here I have cut out a section about Ava, the white android that becomes human-like at the end, right, with Asian skin. So here I've got out a section about the honeycomb mesh of Ava's body, where I basically talk about a history of honeycomb patterns being integrated in nano and biomedical fields and bioengineering. Around the First World War, it was first patented for war aircraft. So I'm linking application of patterns or naturally occurring patterns with histories of militarism and empire. Okay. So like the integration of honeycomb patterns in contemporary large and micro-scale applications, the West's turn, its interest in K-beauty in the last decade, also tells a story of neoliberal imperialism and the afterlives of militarism, but at a scale invisible to the naked eye. Aspirational K-beauty skin is described as luminous, as a glow, as dewiness, or as glass. This K-beauty skin is achieved through relentless, though, routines to shrink or disappear pores, by making skin cells regenerate more rapidly to slow down signs of aging, right? It's a particularly gendered process, and discussion as well. While North American discussions of K-beauty seem to narrate a return to the organic or natural, it is precisely this fascination with skin science that actually make these narratives techno-orientalist. One article in Fusion muses that K-beauty products can be, quote, intimidating because of their advanced technology and vastly unknown ingredients. As exotic innovation, these skincare rituals are entrenched in the discourses that have historically figured Asia and the Asian body as inscrutable, mysteriously ancient, and at the same time displaced in an over-commodified, technologized future. These skin transformations are not to appear as transformations at all, lest they become too Kardashian, too obviously worked on, right? They're supposed to be performances of self-maintenance and upgrades that operate at the invisible or virtually invisible scale of the skin cell and facial pores. The K-beauty face is a racialized and gendered interface. It is a visualizing technology that displays what is usually undetectable to the naked eye: the skin cell, the hair follicle, even molecular ingredients that help your skin retain moisture, right? I just learned about Aqua 3G, which is supposed to be this molecular ingredient that makes your skin dewy, right? Moreover, the glow of K-beauty skin and the glow of the digital screen are actually mutually constitutive. The desire for dewy skin in North America was largely developed through social media performances, right? Even though the language we have around that kind of skin in English are gendered and produced on Instagram and YouTube. Which have proliferated the format and genre of these platforms. Indeed, women's faces have been the interface upon which post-industrial and neoliberal capitalist experiments have been enacted and tested, right? Not even just in this moment. In the 1990s, the Chinese state invested in the beauty industry to offset the economic impacts of massive layoffs in state-owned enterprises. South Korea encouraged Korean women to be consumers rather than factory workers in the 1980s. In order to mark their successful shift into a post-industrial society. The Korean face, and particularly the femme Korean face, was a central discourse in American imperial relations with Korea after the Korean War. Insofar as the currently debated and gawked over popularity of the double eyelid surgery among Korean and other Asian women can actually be traced to a public relations campaign by US occupational forces in Korea that offered free reconstructive surgeries to disfigured war victims. David Palumbo-Liu observes that these reconstructive surgeries, this campaign, entailed the correction of a perceived defect of the Asian face. That is, the drooping upper eyelid, right, the monolid, was associated with dullness, a lack of emotion, mystery, and consequently needed to be corrected or repaired if, quote, the East was to have any authentic contact with the West after the Korean War. And I'm just going to very awkwardly try to wrap up this section of the chapter by saying that, but what I'm trying to think about is that Asian skin as new media, thinking about Asian skin as new media or pores as new media, exposes the impossibility of such authentic contact. In fact, it emphasizes by bringing to the surface that which has been made invisible, made to be invisible or natural, right, in the background. And that is the processes and circulations of neoliberal global capitalism.
Thanks, Danielle. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I was like writing so many things as you were going through, and also just after reading your work, I when I do my K-beauty face mask with my jade roller, I'm just looking at myself in the mirror and being like, hello, Clarice, but also like, is this techno-orientalism? And yes. So when you're talking about the glass skin, it's actually making me, just because I'm a long 18th centurist here, it's making me think about porcelain, the technology of porcelain, and how Europe worked very hard to try to emulate its strength and resistance to heat, and also the science against porcelain, and just how long this has been going on. And then there's also the discourse of porcelain skin, for example, like even thinking about Asian American media when I was growing up, like Mulan, there is, I think, a line in one of the songs about like these Chinese girls in Mulan's village looking like porcelain dolls or things like that. So I feel like this idea of the glass skin is happening right now in reincarnating itself in the Korean glass skin. Can you talk a bit more? I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about like the porousness. It seems that is where you sort of see, and you're critiquing. It sounds like when people say shrink your pores or make the pores invisible. In what ways is porousness a very creative and generative area of the techno-orientalism of K-beauty, and also what you're doing in film? In what ways is that? Sorry, does that question make sense? Like,
yeah, it does. It's a great question. I just wanted to respond earlier to like your work on the long 18th century and the notion, like narratives of the porcelain, right, as decorative, but also as a feature of Asian skin. In some ways gets back to your first question of like actually linking this differentiation between the Orientalism and techno-orientalism is blurred, right? Because we can think about how these narratives have always kind of figured the Asiatic, the Oriental body as something decorative, as something commodified, overly commodified, and therefore has circulation transnationally. Okay, but the question about pores, so I'm thinking about it in multiple ways. On one hand, pores I think are interesting because they breach what the hermetically sealed body, like what we understand to be our organic, fixed, stable, static, and has lots of implications, like it has gendered and sexual implications, right? But it also has implications for how we talk about race. So I'm trying to think about the breach of the body, that pores, having pores is what makes the skin, and one of the things that makes skin organic, like real skin as organic, and yet the impetus to shrink them, to make them actually disappear so that you have glass skin, is about resealing the skin in a way that I read also as a kind of self-management impetus, right? Under kind of neoliberal globalization and neoliberalism, like there's a kind of it's also a gender demand to self-manage and self-present in a way that is, so it's about composition and composure, right? So in some ways the face as a screen is very much about presenting yourself like publicly, facing the market and that sort of thing. So I'm thinking about both, like pores disrupt that possibility because it is about breaches, it's about like disrupting what's clearly in or out, and at the same time, like the idea that you can, the idea that you can shrink your pores, the idea that you can shrink your pores is kind of part of the logic of self-management and beauty. Yeah,
thank you. Chris, is there something about pores and porousness that resonates with your work or your thinking on techno-orientalism and speculative fictions, or anything you wanted to say in response to Danielle's excerpts?
I could. I don't know, do you want me to talk about my work too in exchange with that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Danielle and I's work is quite similar, and it always strikes me more so because we are good friends and colleagues, but the amount that we actually talk about our own work is not as much as it could be, and so I'm always like amazed at like how similar our work is, So my book is thinking through, I think, a lot of similar things. I'm going to show it to you. It's called Open World Empire. This is the academic book. And then let's go to the arcade, actually, if I can show the... so this by Lu Yang. This is the same artist as who did my book. We're in the arcade now. But I wanted to use this image partially because I think what... Danielle and I are both kind of trying to think, or Dr. Wong and I are both trying to think through the, what is techno-orientalism producing? And so this is, if we think back to our Edward Said and Edward Said's main point with Orientalism wasn't only that it was racist and colonial and everywhere, which it was and is, but that the Orientalism produces Asia, right? And so the very, once we are talking about Asia and North America or Asia and Canada as separable things, we are already talking within the discourse of Orientalism, within a colonial racist discourse. And so it's really, really hard to think outside of that, right? But the ways that we think about Asia are absolutely conditioned by Orientalism. And so then the question isn't, is techno-orientalism everywhere? Is it racist? Is it colonial? Because the answer to all of those is yeah. But the question is then more like, so what is it producing, right? It doesn't quite produce Asia as Asia. It produces what I call the Asiatic, where it was just a kind of futurity or digital medium where Asia and the West, or so-called, are not separated in the same way that they are in traditional Orientalism, but they are actually fused together and hybridized in ways that are made to seem anti-racist or non-racist or, whatever. Post-racial, that's the word I'm looking for. And so then we have to kind of try to figure out, so what is this Asiatic form, right? How does it work? What are the kind of, detrimental, violent effects of it? That we just accept and move on with, and then what are the potential possibilities? What can we do with it? once we understand it. And so one thing that Dr. Wong is getting at that I think is very similar to my work is thinking about the how things like organic and inorganic, for example, become the things that separate, so-called good or so-called like naturalized people, and then the so-called like cyborgish Asian, right? And so it's not necessarily where Asian bodies are representing, are equal bad or anything like that, but it's often through this kind of post-racial imaginary where we have to figure out how it's working, right? And so pores, skin, the way that we have our postures in these Asiatic mediums can then be really, really important because that's where a lot of those racisms and that colonial baggage is still very prominent. So it takes a lot of different kind of ways of trying to understand that. And so Open World Empire, my book is, we're back in the arcade. So I'm thinking more about how video games give us a great way to think about this kind of thing. And it's not just games too. In a lot of the conversations I have with Dr. Wong, we're talking a lot about TikTok and like YouTube videos and things like that. And so this is kind of everywhere, but I think video games are fascinating because they are produced in Asia. So many of them are produced in Asia. So many of the main genres come from Asia. A lot of it's, so-called gamer fans, identify with kind of Asian cultures or fetishize Asian cultures. Esports players are, predominantly Asian and so on. And so it's just one of those mediums that is so intertwined with kind of trans-Pacific encounter and colonialism. And so it helps gives us a way of seeing how empire works today and how the Asiatic kind of works onto the body and onto our desires and pleasures. But I'm also concerned with it's not necessarily all a bad thing. I think the Asiatic is just here. We have to kind of deal with it. And so how can we deal with it, right? How can we reform it and change it into something pleasurable and fun and something resistant and anti-war, anti-racist and decolonial and so on. And so in Open World Empire, I try to think about that more through erotics and how we can see play and disobedience in games as kind of working for us and also giving us, a lens on how to see ourselves as perpetrators, as culprits, as thieves, right? As taking part in the war machine, right? And then I try to manifest this a bit more in my novel, which came out in March, this one, All Flowers Bloom. The cover was done by Shama Couvert, who's on Instagram as Heart Over Crown. And I guess we can go back to that background if you want. Okay, now we're
hear your other background.
Yeah, now we're back in the stream. As I put it in the book. And so All Flowers Bloom, I wrote it when I was living for 5 years in mainland China, in Nanjing, and then in Hong Kong. And it uses a lot of, myths and elements from all over the place. But its main thing is it's about love and power and how love and power are intertwined together. And it takes place over a series of different lives from I think it starts 400 BCE and then ends way after the death of mankind and all that. So it's the galactic view of history. But it follows two souls who are kind of intertwined, who love each other, hate each other, and live during moments of intense violence. And so one of the things I was trying to do with All Flowers Bloom is, to go back to pro-Asian racism or racist love, is to think about how love can often work, with power, or power can work through love. And so it explores forms of love that take place during the Balangiga massacre, when in 1901, when American soldiers massacred thousands of Filipino civilians, children and women and so on. But how fetish and desire were kind of imbricated within those events. And so it's, the love of trying to possess somebody, but also the love of trying to accept and love somebody can also have dire consequences that often just don't get thought about. And so for me, like speculative fiction is one of those areas where it's always like a Hunger Games kind of thing. You know, it's like there's violence and hierarchy and rules, and then there's love, and love will save us. And it's like, no, those two things are actually the same in a lot of ways. You know, and I think we're living in a time where that and this comes from like the 60s and 70s too, right? Where the language of love and acceptance becomes so common, so commonplace, and you know, input into hierarchies and institutions that don't, or whose main function, I guess, is to like, you know, reproduce white supremacy in a lot of ways, and reproduce colonialism. And so I'm trying to think about. So the book is itself kind of Asiatic in the sense that it's about reincarnation, it's about rebirth. It has a lot of Asian goddesses and gods, but they're always kind of queered and different and playful and erotic. And I'm trying to use the Asiatic in a way that kind of breaks through the kind of colonial presumptions that are waylaid into it.
It sounds like, similar to Danielle's work, you're not trying to save the Asiatic from Orientalism. You're going into the Asiatic. The other thing that's making me think about a similarity, or the ways in which your works are talking with each other, is again to return to porousness as possibility. You're returning to the body, to the concept of Orientalism, techno-orientalism. The other thing is when you're talking about love and war being the same thing, and how your book illuminates how these two lives keep intertwining. I thought about the porousness of love and war. Sort of there's a porousness between that, and your novel kind of captures that as they're going through the different lives with each other. That it's, oh, sorry, my screen did a weird thing. Yeah, I was thinking of porousness. Danielle, was there anything you sort of wanted to say in response to Chris talking about his work? And
yeah, well, that it's really helpful to think about the love, like the blurry boundaries between, like the way you put it was the Hunger Games, which is like the teen rom-com. I guess it's not teen. The young person, the YA love narrative in the Hunger Games is actually not separate from. It's not even necessarily a respite from or an antidote to. It is actually built into the structure of like the everyone fend for themselves. So there's like a way in which love is part of also that critique of violence, of war, of a fascist state. So there's a way in which that's really interesting to think about. How I guess I would say that in some ways is connected to how I'm thinking about beauty, right? Or and here I'm like, not obviously so many people have thought about this, and I'm thinking about Emily Raimondo's work on beauty regimens as beauty regimes. So there's a way in between the regimen, which is supposed to be about self-care, right? We hear a lot about that, like this is a form of self-care, this is a form of like doing this for me. It's a self-love in some ways that then actually is informed by, and structured by and is part of, right, ongoing history, regimes, but also ongoing histories of occupation, but then also neoliberal like desires to commodify. So there's a kind of way in which that slipperiness, there's a connection there between the slipperinesses of what we're thinking about.
It's interesting you talk about the context of self-care, and we're talking about decolonizing. I actually just learned this week from one of my friend Sue posted something about how, like, she reposted a resource talking about how self-care was actually this movement, this action, this concept that comes out from the Black Panthers movement. And I just learned about that recently. So like even this, it came as a way where, they were doing their work, they were doing their labor. So self-care was a way to kind of look out for each other and look out for yourself as you're doing this kind of work. I'm sorry if I'm simplifying or denuancing that in any way, this history, but it again reminds you of the idea that like love and violence and war or fighting, like they're in tandem with each other when we're thinking about self-care as coming from that history as well. Yeah. Was there Oh, sorry, go on.
I mean, there is definitely that, and a kind of woman of color feminism, Black feminism trajectory of self-care. I don't know if they would use that exact term, or like, you know, Audre Lorde talking about, you know, the need to kind of survive, right, basically, by taking pleasure in things. You know, Audre Lorde also wrote about erotics. James Baldwin, you know, wrote quite a bit about how we are just eating like stale bread, you know, and like Americans particularly, but North Americans and Canadians too, I would presume. And so taking pleasure in things, thinking about sensation and the erotics of the body, to Baldwin, who was of course a gay man, right? Gay Black man, was the part of liberation for him. And so self-care, I think, I don't like the term myself, because I think it just gets used in ways that are not at all, you know, what a lot of folks used to mean when they would say that. There's also, you know, not to bring another dead white guy into the room, but there's also Foucault, who wrote a lot about self-care in his History of Sexuality. That's how it gets translated, at least into English, but also problematized it in the sense that, you know, self-care for him, not sure how well his history reading is in this case, but he associated it more with the Romans, who basically was like the American Empire, who was only looking inward and just doing these health regimes to try and become masters of the self, and all this stuff that Foucault really, really hated, because he liked the way the Greeks did it, which was they didn't just care for themselves, they cared for others, and they cared for their citizenry. This is, again, not quite the most accurate history. A lot of people didn't like Foucault as a historian, per se. But I think that that's also part of the critique too, is that, like, how do you know, when we think of self-care, there is a lot of different parts of it, and there's the kind of like capitalist, you know, induction that goes on, and even like what we were talking about earlier, the kind of beauty regimes could be seen as a form of self-care, right? Lightening your skin could be seen as a form of self-care, and I think those are also part of that history that we can't dismiss. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Thank you. I did have kind of part of why I was really excited for this panel is I was thinking of it sort of as a meta panel in a way as well, because we are taking the LiterASIAN Festival virtually this year. So in talking to scholars and writers of virtual worlds, I just wanted to ask you, what were your thoughts on that? What are your feelings on you know, it can be as general as we're now holding a lot of these types of events online. What does it mean for you as scholars and thinkers and writers to be part of a virtual festival this year on Asian North American writing?
Should I go first? I can go first, I guess. Well, I think what occurs to me just looking at the LiterASIAN festival this year is that we are kind of the like scholars, I guess, I don't know, the UBC scholars who are coming in, and so I think that we have a particular position to say critical things, you know, not to like be, you know, in ways like pro-Asian racism, right? Not to be dismissive of anti-Asian racism or whatnot, but that we come from this, you know, we get paid to think about these things, on, you know, to be real. And so part of the intellectuals, you know, then position is to be critical and unsettle things. Mm-hmm. And so but I don't want that to make anyone feel like anyone's empowering narrative or the way that they love their, you know, whatever. It's like their media, that we're dismissing that at all. But I do think one thing that I've caught on to, just looking at, and this is not just from this year, but from other LiterASIAN events in the past, is that there's this a question that commonly gets asked is about in-betweenness, right? And how Asian Canadians are caught in between these two worlds of like Asia and whiteness. And somebody called it out pretty well, I think, a bit in the last event on last Sunday. I can't remember his name, the Black speaker that they had, which is that when we're thinking about in-betweenness, we're basically like planets competing with each other to be closer to the sun. That is whiteness. Yeah, thank you. That's Kevin. Yeah. And so I think that and I get this a lot with my students too, is a lot of questions about like, where do we belong? You know, who are we really? And how do we fit in between the, you know, all that kind of stuff? And I think the answer is just, it's there. People just don't want to face it, you know, which is that we live in a white supremacist society in a settler colonial state. That's why people are racist towards us. Like, that's why we feel this in-betweenness, you know, and like it. So there's those questions I think can be answered. But I think a lot of us just don't want to face the answers to those questions, the histories behind those questions, or have a hard time reconciling that with, you know, our daily lives. And I think that's where a lot of the real things that like scholars and people who get paid basically to do this kind of work, where we can kind of contribute, because that's the kind of thinking that is really difficult to do. It drives us crazy, honestly, to do it, because it can be like re-traumatizing all the time. It does things where like people don't want to talk to us because they think we're just going to call them out on things. So we end up losing, you know, relationships and friendships and things like that. But as like scholars who are present at a literary event, I think that is one thing that we can kind of keep in mind, that we can kind of, you know, speak truth, because that's part of our job and part of our privilege, right, in being here. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. It does, like, it makes me think. I remember being back in undergrad, one of my communications courses, and someone had told me, like, why is it whenever we study media, it's always a conspiracy theory? I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, we're always like making these critiques. And I understand now in some ways that can be frustrating or disempowering, like when, you know, getting rid of the thing that you love perhaps, but I've always been excited myself by that work. I almost feel like I'm getting like to make a video games reference cheat codes, kind of to how things work and playing around with that. So I think there's a lot of joy as well in the work that we do. Yeah, I remember that conversation last week on in-betweenness and how it has historically been a part of conversation here at LiterASIAN and ACWW. And I really appreciated Kevin for pointing out in-betweenness in orientation to what. And I think today's panel was great in thinking of in-betweenness and orientation to the specific phenomenon of techno-orientalism. So thanks for that. Danielle, did you have any thoughts you wanted to share on being part of a virtual
Yeah, I took the meta question to be like meta. I was thinking about what does it mean to be on Zoom together right now with all of you, because I actually just finished this piece on screen time, and the type of work, but also like our feeling of time under the global pandemic. Has actually been unfolding for a lot of folks, I guess, in more privileged society, in interfaces like this. And so what does it mean? So I've been asking myself, like, what it means to gather and to have conversation in what feels like real time. And yet the pandemic has actually made very clear that we don't actually all exist in the same time, in that, right, the inequities, the particular vulnerabilities of certain groups are uneven. Right. So COVID has exposed those structural vulnerabilities and the unevenness and inequities that are there. And yet there's always this push to be synchronous. This is a term that's like very university planning of, you know, like get your classes synchronous or asynchronous. Right. So the idea of like synchronicity and being together in the same time or real time. I've been thinking maybe too much about it, but thinking about like what our experience of time is and what it might mean that some people are structurally placed to be out of time, right? Or not in the same time zone, timeline, structurally, right? As we see who's made vulnerable, more vulnerable by the pandemic. And then I just think, like, what does it mean to have these discussions this way, right? On Zoom, on this platform and these technologies, and who are they owned by, and, you know, those kinds of questions. So I think that that's, in some ways, the panel's themes are kind of reflecting upon the way we're even gathering.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, when you use the word interface in your work, and when you're using it to think about this medium that we're communicating and conducting, for example, this festival on, I know earlier when we sort of called in first before the start of the event, we were talking about Zoom bombing as well. That's made me think of interface and porousness. So Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your framework today, Danielle. So I don't know if you guys could tell, I kind of asked that meta question as sort of a segue, sort of like end of this portion and a segue into the next portion, which will take it to the Q&A with our attendees. And if you allow me, I think I'll start us off with the first question, if that's all right, as we get into the workshop portion. And then Vincent and I will go and select questions from the attendees today. So my first question is, a lot of folks in our ACWW and LiterASIAN community are writers. As writers and academics who study and teach text and stories, is there any advice you can share in ways we can continue to reimagine techno-orientalism and our virtual worlds, i.e. what kinds of work along with the ones you're creating would you like to see and engage with? Who'd like to answer the question first?
I can go, I guess. I guess we're going in turns, somewhat. Yeah, because we got this question a bit ahead of time. So I've been thinking quite a bit about it because on one hand, I'm thinking like what other writing could be, where could we go in terms of like sci-fi and speculative fiction? And that's something I'm trying to push right in my own work. And there's this journal called Strange Horizons, which is a really great speculative fiction journal, all online. And they used to have, when you went to submit, they would have a list of all of the racist stuff that they see in all their submissions. And so every time they get a submission that had something kind of racist in it, they would just post it as another trope. So they had this long list of like racist tropes in science fiction. So I think those, like, I would encourage writers and creatives to like go out there and search for those lists, because people are just kind of catching on, and there's great databases, like tvtropes.com is a really great one where you just see all the, and then it's kind of fun as a writer to look at those because you're like, oh my God, I have this trope. What do I do? And so I guess the earlier you look at those and think about those, the better. But the other part of that question that I kind of wanted to bring up is like what I would actually like to see in terms of like digital art. Natalie de Los Santos brought this up a bit in one of the last events, which is that, as writers, especially, we're kind of taught to like, jump the highest of who can get like the literary agent, who can get the editor, who can get the big publisher. And, none of us really do the fun thought exercise of saying like, let's say there were like 50 people listening to this. If every single one of you wrote like Shakespeare, how many of you would actually get a big publisher? Like not like Shakespeare, but if you were like geniuses like Shakespeare. And if you remember our Virginia Woolf, who said that like Shakespeare's sister wouldn't have had a chance in hell in 200 or 300 years of making it, then there's the chances are only a couple of us could make it, because we're also tokenized, right? As soon as we get to certain spaces. And the literary publishing world of big publishing is also predominantly, over 80% white, and its editors and its book reviewers and so on. The audience is like AM radio, where, the thing can be progressive, but the audience we know is mostly almost entirely white and older. And so just stop doing that. I would say like stop seeking that prestige, like settle for smaller audiences, for more like global audiences, so basically go online, go to different formats, go to indie publishers if you can, and try to, if you're doing science fiction and you're writing about the digital, digitize your work in some way, like find ways that, put your work in a visual novel or something, or put it in a kind of electric literature form where people can click on it and have fun and like see images while they're doing it, collaborate with people, create new things, like just think outside of the box. Don't follow the same route that everyone's telling you, like this is how you become a great writer, because once you're there, you're probably not going to like it anyways if you ever get up there, because then you're going to look at your audience and realize this is not actually who I want to talk to. And I know a lot of writers who feel that way once they do get on those stages and they look out and they see like not the audience of their community, basically. And so I think that's the kind of writing that I try and encourage my students to do a bit more of, and to think more seriously about. And so that's what I would like to see, especially in speculative and science fiction, where a lot of those readers are also gamers and they're on the internet, all the time anyways. So why not just make it accessible for them?
Yeah. Who are you writing for, and who are you writing with?
Yeah.
Thank you. I know Chris has given us a bit more of a sort of industry, if you will, or non-industry advice on writing. Danielle, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think the question has good implications for thinking beyond traditional models of academic publishing and academic writing, especially like the meta frame of this roundtable around online publishing and writing for online dissemination. One of my favorite recent essays that I've come back to is Xiaoyang Chu's Confessions of a Techno-Orientalist. It's a blog post, but it's such an interesting essay form in that she's also a visual artist. And so it integrates some of that, but also the essay form is also a kind of performance piece in that it is an essay that is in progress, right? So she'll strike out words, she'll edit, and you'll see the process of editing. And so in some ways, the techno-orientalist, or the fascination with technology is built into the argument in the form of writing. And that's actually some of the creative stuff I've shown to some students before in terms of rethinking what we mean by the essay and academic writing. And now that I'm saying this out loud, I would like to think about doing that more this term in particular as we teach in these weird times of teaching online. So there's interesting ways in which that reorients what we understand to be proper or legitimate, right, forms of knowledge. So thinking about these platforms is sometimes helpful.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I found the blog post. I just sent it into the chat. I think we're ready, Vincent, if you are, Danielle and Kawika, if you are, to answer some of our audience's questions. Vincent, did you want to pick the first question?
Sure. There's a question here for both speakers. Both of your works reveal how problematic some of our activities, gaming and beauty, i.e., can be, but also the possibilities to bring those very activities to a better place. Do you have any suggestions on how we can engage those in a better manner? Danielle, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that question. And naming like gaming and beauty, I feel like there's also some interesting things linking, like interesting narratives linking beauty and gaming. But I won't have time to get into it. I don't know about making them do things better. Although that question is very fascinating. I don't know if the better is something I've thought about really, but definitely rethinking, yes, of course, as you put it, problematic systems and infrastructures, right? And histories that are behind these activities and that inform our purchasing patterns, like what we buy, what we think we need to buy, that kind of thing, right, in terms of industry. Certainly there's that's obvious now, right? But so I don't know about better practices, but that these practices can be approached or help us think through these questions in a more generative way than just these are bad, right? So often my students and myself come away with okay, does it mean that I never should buy a face cream, right? Maybe that's the takeaway for some folks, but that might be. But I think I'm also interested, I guess I frame maybe not better, but what are the other possibilities, right? So one way of reading, doing this stuff to the face is that it actually denaturalizes what we understand to be essential or static or fixed about our identity or our self-presentations, right? And folks have written about the possibilities of makeup and self-fashioning from queer, trans, but also in terms of studies of critical race studies, right? Have also, these forms of critique also find possibilities for self-fashioning, for fluidity, for becoming, right? There are ways in which beauty, although loaded, is of course, right, part of these complicated experiences of presenting yourself, right? But then knowing that presentation is not fixed. In fact, that presentation can be strategic. It can be a performance. It can be, about engaging with others. It could be about creating bonds. So there's different ways that I think about the possibilities, of in this case, beauty practices.
A way to play porousness. I'm going to ask the next question. This one is from Amanda. Thank you, Danielle, for sharing so many luminous ideas. Like, at least I feel these concepts rising up as I do my skincare routine or ritual myself, and thinking about ritual as, to quote you, performance of updates. My question, what are some thoughts you have around the role of desire in your discussion? Example, the connection between neoliberal desires latent in techno-orientalist interfaces such as skincare, plus invisibilized labor. And she can rephrase that if it's unclear. But yeah, what a great question, Amanda. Thanks.
It's a beautiful question. I loved your pun around luminosity, the luminous insight as glowing skin. It's a really profound question. Desire is something I'm thinking through in the book project, because I think as Kawika and I are thinking about, also like pleasure is what complicates a simple like good versus bad reading of techno-orientalist forms, and our experiences of everyday techno-orientalism. They're not just like high concepts, they're actually like in our everyday interactions, right? So, or even in the shows we watch, films we watch. So desire is part of the everyday. So I'm trying to think about everydayness, and desire and pleasure for me is how we experience these objects and products and rituals. And so we can't take that out of our analyses of them. So in some ways, like desiring to feel these things on the skin on a very kind of basic level, tells us, it is kind of like tells us both how ingrained neoliberalism is felt, like it's on the body, like it's felt this so viscerally. And yet, what does it mean to feel good? What does it mean to feel pleasure? Can that do something different? If not, what does that mean about interrogating our own desires? So I don't know if that answers the question, but I guess I'm just saying desire is such a helpful way of thinking about the complications of these conversations.
Okay, thanks. And so I'm so sorry. I actually realized I did not give Kawika a chance to answer the other questions about video games and beauty and making it better, but I wonder if that can tie into Amanda's question as well about desire and how it made Danielle think about pleasurability and
Yeah, that's okay. Because now I'm just thinking about what Danielle was saying, which was really fascinating. And so now I'm caught up in that. But so the role of desire and pleasure, well, like Danielle was saying, we need to interrogate that, consistently interrogate that. And I was just listening, sometimes to like help get prepped up for these events. I like to listen to like my favorite artists do interviews and things like that. So I was listening to Kathy Park Hong, whose book Minor Feelings y'all should read. It's a great book. But she has these moments where she's talking about going to MFA programs, which she calls, it's going to make me a bit giddy to say this, but she calls it there, it's like watching the movie Get Out, and there's that scene where he's like, it's almost like the movement never happened here. And so that's how Kathy Park Hong describes the best MFA program in the world, which is the Iowa program. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. Why did I mention that? Oh, because she also talks about pleasure and desire. And so she's thinking about how, as artists, we are told to narrate our stories. And we're told consistently that the more we tell our stories, the better the world's going to be. Never really having to account for the fact that the world expects us to tell those stories in a very particular way that gives the audience particular kinds of pleasures and feeds into their desire to see model minority subjects, to think of themselves as more civil and more progressive than Asian countries, Muslim countries, etc. More progressive than Asian Canadian families and cultures, right? Who are just lost to misogyny and, anti-mental health and horrible people and so on. And so a lot of us are told to write memoirs and stories of our lives that are basically that, right? Feeding into those pleasures and desires, and without actually interrogating why we are expected to write those. Right, and what that does to the world. And I'm not like anti-memoir. I read memoirs a lot, and I love memoirs. But I think that we are living in a time where memoirs are like the #1 selling thing, almost more than you know, the Hunger Games things and like speculative fiction now, where if you are a person of color writing, you're going to be asked to write a memoir. And, you know, I was just reading Jesmyn Ward's memoir after reading her first 3 fiction books. And she says in her memoir that her agent told her to write it, you know, and that's what we are all facing right now. And so I think as we are doing that, we shouldn't just be drawn to telling our stories in the ways that the world wants us to, right? So Kathy Park Hong calls it a consistent process of self-interrogation, that we have to show that self-interrogation in our work when we tell our stories, as a way to account for, you know, the desires of the audience wanting to see that story, and our own desires and wanting to be accepted, or wanting proximity to whiteness and wanting to be published, and so on, right? And so unless we really tackle those and interrogate ourselves on that level, then our stories might actually be weaponized against not only us, but other, you know, marginalized peoples. Yeah, and so that's, I mean, I could talk also about how open world empire is about erotics and about pleasure and desire. And I love to play video games. And so my only answer to that would be play more independent games like Butterfly Soup, which is one of my favorite games. It's the #1 game on itch, which is the big indie game platform. It's about queer Asian women, written and made by a queer Asian woman. Y'all should go play that game. It's it'll enlighten us all.
Thank you. On the subject of playing, one question we have from Diana Ng is, hi, was the exact, oh, sorry, things are moving. Where's her, oh, her question disappeared, but Diana was asking about self-care and its historical use. And I know we kind of touched on that, and if there was anything you wanted to add to that, or I'm just learning about it myself. Yeah, both Danielle and Chris.
I think we alluded to it briefly as when history of self-care is emerging, like often cited, traced back to Audre Lorde, and as having actually a Black radical feminist significance. And as Chris pointed out, it was about a form of survival, and it's self-care, right, is as a kind of radical response to the state, right? State-sanctioned, state-approved anti-Blackness, right? So there's a way in which self-care is not. I don't want to foreclose radical implications of political resistance and radical implications from self-care. I think as a lot of us are seeing, like what has happened in the capture of this term into for particularly contemporary conversations around self-care are quite, many people argue it's quite neoliberal in that it's about self-help or this constant work, and it is labor, this constant work of making sure you're taking care of yourself in your downtime, so that your leisure time becomes very trickily not actually downtime, right? It's also this, like, sometimes it becomes like free labor where you end up posting content, and you know, so that's the kind of trickiness we're trying to navigate with the term self-care. So the way that I'm using it, sorry, to clarify, is to name the way these concepts of caring for yourself are center the self as opposed to a collectivity, and it's about creating an individual, like a self-enterprising, you know, self-improving individual that then is, in spite of the state, you know, can just do it, pull themselves up, you know. That's what I'm alluding to about the dangers of thinking about self-care in this way.
Thanks.
I can say just a little bit about that too, because well, to bring Foucault back, his lectures in the 1980s, right? He talks about this term neoliberalism as intertwined, as one of the main kind of like forces of it is this desire for self-optimization, is what he calls it. And so we have to be very careful that when we're thinking about care of ourselves, care of the self, we're not confusing that with the kind of self-optimization of capitalism, because capitalism and, you know, the colonial state, for the most part, wants most of us to be healthy, happy individuals, because that makes good laborers, right? Good workers. Doesn't want us to be too happy or to take too much pleasure of things, because then we might realize there's things outside of the wage and outside of capitalism that actually make us happy. So just being kind of satisfied with the world is what we're supposed to be, right? And so at what sense is our self-care just self-optimization for capitalism? I think that's the kind of disturbing anxiety I think that a lot of us feel. To plug another book, Ling Ma's book, Severance, is all about self-optimization in a time when the world is ending, right? And yet this Asian American woman is still pushing herself to self-optimize, to tablet, all of her time, all of her energy into working for the system, even as that system no longer even exists. And that's the kind of violence that it does to our bodies and to ourselves, right? To continually be put in the place where we have to optimize ourselves for our job or for our family or for our relationships, whatever.
Yeah, so just to connect the Ling Ma's Severance, which is this really interesting novel, is I alluded to a piece I was writing on screen time. That piece is actually about severance. So there's like an interesting, because in that novel, she continues to send emails to her managers, even though like New York is completely decimated by this pandemic. So there's a way in which like we continue to be in touch. We continue to be on screens, even when the world is on fire, right? Literally. So there's, and that kind of gets also self-optimization continues, even when the self is thrown into confusion, right? Under a global crisis.
Since we're in the same vein as pleasure, Michel Foucault and all that, there's a question here that asks, what are the ways to bring the willingness to talk about pleasure? Chris?
Oh gosh. Well, I guess in my own classes and thinking, I route this conversation mostly through queer theory, because queerness is a kind of forms of pleasure that, again, the state and capitalism don't really want us to have and talk about and think about, because it is an excess to those regimes. Though this is, again, like 1970s or 1980s, early 1990s queer theory, before the kind of gay marriage acts and things like that, where a lot of what used to be seen as queer desires have now been kind of incorporated in different ways. But this is one thing I try to think about in Open World Empire too, is what forms of desires then exist that we don't understand or see, or that are in excess to these systems. And so this is one reason I continually go back to Foucault in this, because, as problematic, I mean, he is quite like, I don't know what to call it. He knew Edward Said, so he knew what Orientalism was. And yet he was still quite Orientalist in a lot of ways, in the ways that he saw Asians and Japanese particularly, but also Iranians, as like having these kind of erotics forms of being aware of desires that to him Westerners had either forgotten or never thought about. But I think what that does is it still pushes us to think about what are the desires that are accepted, that are normalized, that help the state and help capitalism. What are the ones that are in excess of those things? And so I think video games are fascinating for that, because there are these forms of queer perversity, and games are like all of those forms of queer perversity, where they, Japanese games, for example, are constantly kind of under attack because they have representations of like young men and women, right, who are sexualized. So they're seen as very perverse, and the whole culture gets renamed as perverse for that reason. There's the kind of idea that games are akin to like masturbation, and that only like young men who can't talk to women are the only people who play games and things like that. So like there's something about gaming and perversity, or like excess of desire, that games are associated with. And so that makes me very interested in game cultures, right? So what do people do who are being seen as perverse by default or by joining in with these cultures? And I just read a book by Natalie de los Santos, who was, at the last week's event, Hasta Mañana. I bought that book. It's a great book to think about that, because she's speaking as who was seen at the time as a young woman, but was mostly playing video games with young men. And everybody saw that in a perverse way. Her family, her teachers, and so on, all kind of take that up as a perverse practice. And so she's queered in ways that are not, traditionally queer in the way that we think about queerness. And so I feel like that is one thing that we can look at about how desire and pleasure work, and to also think about how that those cultures, game cultures, can then think more internationally about the way that like U.S. empire operates, that militarism operates, and so on.
Thank you. Just a quick heads up. We are at 2:24, 2:25, so we have about 5 minutes left. Sophie has approved us for going overtime. If Danielle and Kawika, if you're comfortable with answering, I think we just have about 3 more questions to get through. Otherwise, attendees who have just sort of siphoned off the day for this time, you're free to leave. But if Chris and Danielle, you're comfortable staying on to answer a few more questions.
I can.
Yeah.
Sure.
Danielle. Okay, great. So the next question I wanted to ask is, what works, academic and literary, would you recommend for ACWW members to read? I realize that we've kind of been making recommendations along the way in terms of video games and books. I've been trying to like update the chat with the books that are coming up, but was there any sort of other film or media or books that you wanted to recommend on the topic of speculative, on the genre of speculative fiction and techno-orientalism that you've enjoyed?
Yeah, so like we said recently, Ling Ma's novel has been really fascinating and getting a lot of circulation in terms of literary conversations about what it's doing. Another one that I really like thinking about, it's kind of a trippy text, is Eugene Lim's Dear Cyborgs, which takes on the figure of the cyborg and then complicates the memoir form. So it reads kind of randomly at first read as like fragments of who's speaking, whose voice is this, and that's kind of the point. So Eugene Lim's Dear Cyborgs, and I really like reading and teaching with Hari Kunzru's Transmission, which thinks about the computer virus in relationship to migrant labor. Especially a labor force recruited from India in the early development of Silicon Valley. So it links histories of of Silicon Valley, migration, borders, and the computer virus, and the history of the computer virus in really creative ways and fun ways, I think. So those are just the 2 I'm thinking off the top of my head right now.
Sorry, I actually missed the full title of the second one, Transmission by...
It's called Transmission. Yeah, the author is Hari Kunzru.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go. I love giving recommendations. The biggest ones to me are Larissa Lai's work. Saltfish Girl was very inspirational to me in a lot of ways. And it's a novel that's kind of about Vancouver, about the diaspora, a futuristic Vancouver. And her new novel, Tiger Flu, which is this really trippy, psychedelic, and really fun novel that's also kind of about Vancouver, or a futuristic way of looking at Vancouver. Larissa's work has been really amazing and foundational to a lot of writers out there in Canada, in Vancouver particularly. And to All Flowers Bloom, actually, there's pieces of homages, I guess, to Saltfish Girl, where Saltfish Girl is kind of about the past and the future, coming closer to each other. But Larissa, she skips the modern day period by like 100 years or something. And so All Flowers Bloom actually does the same thing. Mm-hmm. So there's like interesting nods and both All Flowers Bloom and Tiger Flu also have, I think, totally coincidentally, have a big flu in it, and the flu in Tiger Flu wipes out almost all the men, and the fog, as it's called in All Flowers Bloom, wipes out almost all the men. So we were thinking along very clear lines about how we could think about the future in kind of queer, messy ways. And so Larissa's work has been awesome. Yeah, read that.
Thank you, Vincent. Were there other? Did you want to read out the other questions?
Yeah, so there's 2 questions coming from the same person, which is related. So this is going to be our last question for the day. This person works in academia and healthcare, and they are hierarchical organizations, and she feels that it's not safe to talk about racism the way you are speaking about racism. She's asking about suggestions on how to engage in these conversations. And the second part of the question is, what are white presumptions? Could you give some examples? It's a two-pronged question.
Did you want to go, Danielle?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the two. Yeah, the first part of the question, I just want to express that, like, that is a very real situation and a tricky situation to find one in, as being the only one, right? Whether it's a department, an institution, the unit you're working in that, like, whether you're the only BIPOC, right, person, or the only, so that is tricky without knowing the specific context of the institution you're working in. But I guess something I've just learned, just thinking out loud, like something I've learned this year, is it's really important to have people backing you, so that when you do speak out, it's not just in isolation, and it's not just you because you are putting yourself on the line, even if it feels like a minor conversation or it's like a microaggression or whatever. There is a kind of possibility of that coming back to you in very real, material, and scary ways. So I've just been reflecting on how important it is to think about these as not individual interventions, but as part of whatever collective you have, or whoever you have to kind of back you. And often I call upon white colleagues and folks to do the kind of riskier work of backing, or more senior folks in the academic setting. Or at least I expect that. Even if I don't call upon. This is what I expect, right? And I think that is if there is any kind of solidarity in terms of race around these conversations, that is what one component of it could look like. I feel like I'm only answering the first part of the question, but I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very, very difficult question. And this is something that I think we try to stress to our students in the Social Justice Institute where I work, which is that, if we don't talk about these issues of race now, when you're out, in these jobs and in these markets and with colleagues who you don't know very well, those conversations are going to be much, much, much harder to have. And so we try to kind of get that past, to the students, because then it kind of allows us to get to all the kind of questions that they might be too nervous to ask about, right? That this is the time and this is the space to do so. And so I think what you're going through sounds like a lot of, students who I've had who go out into, like, quote unquote, the real world or whatever. Suddenly they can't talk about race the same way that they used to in the classroom, or that they used to with their friend. And so on one hand, there's like us trying to negotiate who we are in different spaces, right? And trying to protect ourselves. And so I think, what Danielle's saying is very true, that sometimes there are strategies in each context, right? And trying to get to know, like, people who are on your side, people who aren't, and try to think more strategically than you can, like, in a college classroom where we're expected to just say whatever we think, or whatever. You have to be very strategic in different contexts, even with your families. There's always, you can kind of gamify it in a way, right? There are certain rules and genres everywhere you go. It's much easier to deal with those situations once you've kind of become the part of these networks of folks who try to tie down those rules and those genres. And so just kind of like hold on and try to, do that kind of messy thinking, because then you can start to find ways to change things. About the white presumptions question, here I go, like, insisting on another novel, but there's a novel called Fixer Chow, which is about a queer Filipino, very poor dude living in New York City. And this is during the 1980s and 90s gentrification of all the queer clubs in the village and so on. And so his whole life is being destroyed in front of him, of all the queer spaces where queerness is starting to turn into this pink capitalism thing. So he decides that he's going to get revenge on the upper class. And he realizes that the upper class are all obsessed with these kind of Asian elements, things like decorating their house in Asian ways, whatever that means, and Asian spiritualism. And so he dresses up as this guy called Master Chow, who goes into people's houses and rearranges things in kind of feng shui ways and just gives this like mock spiritual advice. And it's not just white people that he's doing this to, it's a cosmopolitan upper class. Some of them are actually Asian American who fetishize Asia in this way. And so the book is brilliant for many reasons, but one is because it's basically like a long list of all of the tropes that Asian spirituality, Asian self-help, Asian healing kind of practices get caught up with, and in a kind of fun way where it's like this guy is just doing these characters that everyone recognizes, this kind of South Asian spiritualism, this East Asian spiritualism, and it works. And the funny kind of thing about the novel is when he actually rearranges everyone's house to give them bad luck instead of good luck, and it actually works. Their lives start to get destroyed because of what he does. And so there's all these like silly elements in it like that. But yeah, that book is an amazing kind of book to think about the kind of health industry and spiritual industry and the way that it's already kind of Asiatic in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Sounds like a great read. Vincent, I think we have gone through all the questions for today. Thank you so much for taking the time to go through the audience's questions and answer them, Chris and Danielle. So just to kind of wrap things up, are there any future projects, talks, events, or courses that you would like to let our attendees know about?
Yeah, I'll use this opportunity to plug something that's not necessarily my work, but other people's work, which is I feel way more comfortable always plugging. On September 17th, and hopefully you'll see a more wider circulation of this, there's going to be, I'm organizing with some folks yet another, virtual Zoom roundtable, but it will be on COVID-19. We're calling it COVID-19 vulnerabilities, and we're thinking about multiple meanings of vulnerability, right? Structurally imposed, the inequities, right, of vulnerability of the pandemic, but also what it might mean to be vulnerable in that we are open to collectivity, mutual care, interdependence. And that panel will focus specifically on histories of Asian racialization and pandemics. And we have a great panel of speakers, and that will be on the 17th. It's a Thursday, which I'm very excited about, and it's coming up. So there'll be promo material and stuff coming out around that.
Yeah. Please send it to us so we can send it out on our channels. Thanks. Yeah. Chris?
Thanks. I don't really have anything to plug. I'm going to be at a literary event by Word Vancouver that Word Vancouver is hosting on September 27th. I think that's the next thing I have planned. Some more information should come out about it. That's about it.
Great. Okay. Thank you again so much for joining us. Thank you, Sophie, for doing the tech and keeping the virtual roof up above our heads today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank
you for your work in moderating. It was wonderful moderation.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. It was so great to hear from your work. Longtime fans. And Vincent, thank you again for helping me moderate today. So anyway, I hope everyone has a great Saturday. Thanks for sharing your Saturday afternoon for us, everybody. And have a great one. Stay safe.